Hello friends, welcome to my Heartbreak Stories channel. I invite you to join me on a walk through the city during the Fires Festival and listen to a new and interesting story. Let's go with me.
Some betrayals don't come with a warning. They come dressed in a smile, in a quiet life that looks perfectly normal from the outside. Today's story is about a man who discovered that everything he trusted was built on a lie and chose to respond not with rage, but with precision. Let's listen.
My wife told 60 people I was terrible in bed, right to my face. I walked out without a word. She thought that was the end of it. It was actually the beginning. By the time she realized what I'd been building in the silence, she had already lost everything she tried to take from me. My name is Nathan Carver. I'm 44 years old. I'm an orthopedic surgeon at Mercy General in Charlotte, North Carolina, and until that October night, I thought I had built something solid, a marriage, a family, a life worth being proud of. I had a wife I loved, 2 kids I'd walk through fire for, and a career that put people back on their feet for a living. Literally. Then Vivian opened her mouth in front of 60 people who knew my name. The gala was held at the Whitmore Hotel Ballroom downtown, all vaulted ceilings and chandeliers, and the kind of crowd that smiles with their teeth and means none of it. I come straight from a late consult at the hospital, still in my good suit, tie loosened 1 notch. I wasn't late. But I wasn't early either, and Vivian had already had 2 glasses of whatever the open bar was offering. I spotted her across the room, near the east windows, surrounded by a cluster of women I recognized from her studio network. She was animated, laughing that particular laugh she used when she wanted the room to orbit around her. Dorian Sloan stood just off her left shoulder, her brand consultant, as she called him, 38 years old, jawline like a magazine cover, and a handshake I'd always found too familiar. I started walking toward them. I was maybe 30 feet away when I heard it. Nathan. Vivian said the name lightly, like an answer to a question someone had asked. He's sweet. He really is. She paused just long enough to let the sweetness curdle. But terrible in bed. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It landed in the exact pocket of silence between songs, and the women nearest her caught every syllable. 2 of them covered their mouths. One looked directly at me. She'd seen me approaching, and her expression shifted into something I can only describe as theatrical horror. Vivian turned. Our eyes met. She didn't flinch. She sipped her drink. I stopped walking. I stood there with my hands at my sides, and I did not give her the reaction she'd set the stage for. No color in my face. No voice raised. I simply looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand, and then I turned and walked back toward the entrance. Rick Hole caught me at the coat check. My oldest friend, 47 years old and built like a former defensive lineman because he was one, had watched the whole thing from the bar. Tell me you didn't hear that, I said. He handed me my jacket. Half the room heard it, Nate. I put on my coat. I didn't say anything else. In the car, I sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes. Not crying, not punching the steering wheel, just running calculations, the way a surgeon does before a procedure too complicated to rush. What did I know? What did I need to know? What was the first step? I drove home. The kids were with my mother for the weekend. The apartment was dark and quiet. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. Not to search for anything incriminating. Not yet. Just to think in front of a screen, because that's how my brain works. I pulled up her joint accounts. I pulled up 3 months of credit card statements. I didn't find anything that night that I could prove, but I found enough gaps, enough charges that didn't match any conversation I could recall, to know I needed to look harder. Vivian came home at 12:47. I heard her heels on the floor, heard her pause in the hallway when she saw the kitchen light on. She appeared in the doorway. You left early. I did. I replied without looking up. Are you going to make this dramatic? I closed the laptop and looked at her then, calm, direct, the way I look at a resident who's about to make a mistake they can't take back. Not tonight, I told her. Go to bed. She studied me for a moment, looking for the wound she expected to see. When she didn't find it, something shifted behind her eyes, something that looked almost like unease. Good, I thought. Let her wonder. Vivian didn't bring up the gala the next morning. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone, and asked me if I'd remember to schedule Cooper's dentist appointment. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that she had stood in a ballroom and handed my dignity, to 60 people like it was party favors. I answered her questions. I kept my voice neutral. And the moment she left for her 9 o'clock class at the Uptown studio, I sat back down at the kitchen table with the credit card statements I hadn't finished the night before. I'm a surgeon. My entire career is built on reading what's beneath the surface, the scan, the image, the thing the body is trying to hide. Financial records work the same way if you know what you're looking for. And what I found over the next 3 hours was not subtle once I started pulling the threads. 11 hotel charges over 8 months. Not the kind of hotels we use for family trips. The kind with valet parking and a nightly rate that assumed you weren't sleeping much. All of them billed through a wellness vendor account Vivian had set up for studio hospitality expenses. I'd signed off on that account 14 months ago without reading the fine print. That was on me. I photographed every statement. I created a folder on a drive she didn't have access to and labeled it simply documentation. Then I called Rick. He picked up on the second ring. You doing okay? I need a name. I told him. Someone discreet. Private investigator. Not the kind that shows up in a trench coat. The kind that knows how to pull financial trails without leaving fingerprints. A pause. Then, I know a guy. Ex-forensic accountant. Does private work now. Used him when my business partner tried to skim the books 2 years ago. Send me his number. Rick went quiet for a beat. Nate, how bad is it? I looked at the folder on my screen. I don't know yet. That's the problem. His name was Gerald Marsh, mid-50s, operated out of Plain office near the airport. No frills and no small talk. I met him that afternoon. I laid out what I had. He looked it over without expression, asked 4 precise questions, and told me he'd have a preliminary report within 72 hours. Walking back to my car, I checked my phone. Vivian had texted, "Don't forget Paige is dance at 4. No punctuation after it. No warmth. Just logistics." I picked Paige up at school at 3:45. She was quiet in the back seat, her dance bag on her lap, staring out the window. She was 11 and already had the kind of perceptiveness that made me careful about what I said around her. "Dad," she said as we pulled onto the highway, "is everything okay with you and Mom?" I kept my eyes on the road. "What makes you ask?" "She's been weird." Paige said it plainly, the way kids do when they're stating a fact rather than asking a question. Like, she laughs too much when she's on her phone, and then she gets annoyed when you come into the room. I didn't respond right away. I let the observation sit. "I'm handling some things," I said finally. "Don't worry about grown-up stuff. Okay? Your job is dance." She didn't push it, but she didn't look convinced either. That night after the kids were in bed, Vivian came into the study where I was reviewing patient files. She leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed, a pose that I recognized as her version of casual and controlled. "You've been strange since Friday," she said. I looked up from the desk. "Have I?" "You're doing the thing where you go quiet and expect me to guess what's wrong." I set down my pen. "I'm not doing anything, Vivian. I'm reviewing files. It's what I do at 10 o'clock on a Sunday." Her jaw tightened. "So, we're just not going to talk about the gala. Was there something you wanted to say about it?" The question landed differently than she expected. She had come in ready for a fight. Something loud that she could win on volume. My calm deflected it. "I'd had too much to drink," she said after a moment. "It was a stupid comment." "It was," I agreed. She waited for more. I didn't give it to her. After a few seconds, she pushed off the doorframe and went to bed. I sat there for another hour after she left, not working, just thinking. Gerald Marsh was going to come back to me in 72 hours with whatever he found. Stuart Pratt, the attorney Rick had recommended, had a consultation slot available Thursday morning. I was building something. Slowly, carefully, the way you build a surgical plan. Assess, prepare, sequence, execute. What I hadn't expected came the following Tuesday. Marsh called at 7 in the morning, 2 days earlier than promised. His voice was level but clipped, the voice of a man who'd found more than he'd gone looking for. "You need to come in," he said. "Today if you can." I rearranged 2 appointments and was at his office by 10. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were printed bank records, a series of photographs, and a screenshot of a registration document. "The hotel charges are the least of it," Marsh said. "Your wife transferred $160,000 out of your joint investment account over the past 11 months. Small increments, different destination accounts. It runs through a Shell LLC registered in Delaware. Company name is DV Creative Partners." He paused. DV, Dorian, and Vivian. I stare at the document. There's more. Marsh added, and open to the next page. Dorian Sloan, the man who stood at my wife's shoulder at the gala with his hand on her hip, had an open civil fraud complaint filed against him in Cook County, Illinois, 18 months ago. 3 women. Significant sums. The case was still active. My wife had been funneling our money to a man currently under investigation for financial fraud. I closed the folder. I picked up my phone. I texted Stuart Pratt one sentence. Thursday won't work. Can we meet tomorrow? He replied in 4 minutes. I'll make it work.
$160,000 moved quietly in small pieces while he was at work saving people. I don't think most men could have sat with that information and stayed as composed as Nathan did, but that composure, that's exactly what she never saw coming.
I drove home in silence, and for the first time since the gala, what I felt wasn't hurt. It wasn't even anger. It was the cold, focused clarity I get in the operating room when the procedure just got harder than expected, and I have to be better than I planned to be. Rick Holt has been in my life since we were both 19 years old, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment near campus that smelled like instant noodles and ambition. He played football. I studied anatomy. We had nothing in common on paper, and yet 30 years later, he was still the first person I called when something went sideways. That said something. I met him Wednesday evening at a sports bar near his office, the kind of place where the TVs are always on and nobody listens to anybody else's conversation. I ordered coffee. Rick ordered a beer and looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for the past 2 years whenever Vivian's name came up, like a man sitting on something he'd been waiting to say. Tell me what you know, I said. All of it. Don't manage me. He set down his glass. About a year ago, I ran into Vivian and Sloan at the Marriott bar on Trade Street. Not a studio event, not a business dinner. They were in a corner booth, and the body language wasn't professional. He paused. Almost called you that night. Then I talked myself out of it because I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to blow up your marriage on a maybe. I absorbed that. Why didn't you say something later? Because every time I try to bring up Sloan, you told me he was just her brand guy, and I was reading into it. Rick's voice wasn't defensive. It was tired. You didn't want to hear it, Nate. I watched you not want to hear it for 18 months. He was right. I had done exactly that. I'd filed his warnings under Rick worries too much and moved on. That was on me, not on him. I need one more thing from you, I said. Stuart Pratt, your attorney. He's good. Best family law guy I know. He doesn't lose. I'm meeting him tomorrow morning. Rick nodded slowly. You going to be okay tonight? I've been okay every night so far. He looked at me for a long moment. That's either impressive or concerning. Probably both, I admitted. And for the first time since the gala, I almost smiled. Stuart Pratt's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Clean lines, no clutter, the kind of environment that said I don't waste time on anything unnecessary. He was 52, gray at the temples, and had the calm, measured bearing of someone who had heard every possible version of human disaster and stopped being surprised by any of it. I laid out everything. The hotel charges, the LLC, the $160,000, Marsh's report on Sloan's fraud complaint in Illinois. Stuart listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then opened a legal pad. You haven't confronted her. No. Good. Don't. He tapped his pen once on the desk. The moment you confront her, she lawyers up and the assets move. Right now you have the advantage of information. We preserve that. He leaned forward slightly. Here's what matters most to you. Custody or financials? Custody, I said without hesitation. The money is secondary. He nodded like he'd expected that. Then we document everything that affects the children's stability. Parental absence, financial misconduct, the character of the man she's been with, especially with the fraud case on his record. We build the custody argument first and let the financial case ride alongside it. I walked out of that meeting with a legal strategy, a list of next steps, and the first genuine sense of forward motion I'd felt since the night at the Whitmore. The hard part came that afternoon. I picked Cooper up from soccer practice at 4:30. He was 9 years old and had his mother's coloring and my stubbornness, and he climbed into the car still muddy and announced that he was starving. I stopped for burgers. We sat in the parking lot while he ate, and somewhere between the fries and the milkshake, he said, quietly, without looking at me, Mom and Dorian were at the studio when I went with her on Saturday. He was there for a really long time. I kept my expression even. Did that bother you? Cooper shrugged the way boys do when something bothers them, and they don't want to admit it. He's kind of in charge when he's there. Like he tells the staff what to do and stuff. I chose my words carefully. I'm going to take care of things, co-op. That's my job. He looked at me then. Are you and Mom going to get divorced? The question sat in the air between us. I didn't flinch from it. I don't know yet. I told him. But whatever happens, you and Paige are going to be fine. I promise you that. He went back to his milkshake. He didn't say anything else. But he leaned slightly toward me for the rest of the drive home, the way kids do when they need to feel the weight of you beside them. That night, Vivian asked me to look over a contract for new studio equipment, a leasing agreement for 3 reformer machines at the Dilworth location. I reviewed it without comment and handed it back. The vendor name on the contract was a company I hadn't seen before. I wrote it down after she left the room. I added it to the folder. Gerald Marsh called Friday morning with his full report. I took the call in my car in the hospital parking garage, 20 minutes before my first procedure, because some conversations require the kind of privacy that offices don't offer. Sloan has a history, Marsh said, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man reading from notes. The Illinois complaint is still open. 3 plaintiffs, all women who invested in a creative brand fund he ran out of Chicago. Total claims, just under $400,000. He relocated to Charlotte 14 months ago, which puts his arrival here about 2 months before your wife opened the joint LLC. So he came here specifically to run the same play. I said, that's what the timeline suggests. He identified high-profile women in creative industries with access to capital. Your wife fits the pattern exactly. I stared at the concrete wall in front of me. How much of our money is recoverable? Depends on how the LLC is structured and whether the funds have been moved offshore. I've got a forensic accountant I work with. I'd recommend bringing her in. Do it. There was a pause. There's one more thing. Marsh's tone shifted slightly, the way it does when a man is about to say something he finds personally distasteful. I ran a full background, including social media cross-referencing. Sloan was photographed at a charity event in 2019, the Hargrove Foundation dinner. Your wife was also at that event. I pulled the attendee list. Another pause. So were you. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. Dorian Sloan had been in the same room as my wife 3 years before she introduced him to me as her brand consultant. 3 years. The entire timeline I thought I understood had just shifted backward. I went into surgery and spent 4 hours rebuilding a shattered tibial plateau with the kind of focused precision that left no room for anything else. When I came out, I felt steadier. The operating room does that. It strips everything down to the essential task, and when you finish, the world outside it becomes slightly more manageable. I called Stuart Pratt on my lunch break, told him about the 2019 overlap. That changes the duration framing significantly, Stuart said. If this relationship predates what she's claimed, it affects the division of assets acquired during that period. Everything she built with studio revenue during a 3-year affair is subject to different scrutiny. How do I prove the 2019 connection? Marsh's photograph is a start. We subpoena her phone records from that period as part of discovery. Text logs, call logs. If they were communicating before she introduced him as a professional contact, that establishes the deception. I leaned against the wall in the hospital corridor, watching orderlies push a cart past. Normal day for everyone else in the building. Stuart, I said, I also want to talk about Paige and Cooper. Cooper told me Sloan has been at the studio giving instructions to staff. He's becoming a presence in spaces where my children are. Stuart's voice went precise. Document every instance. Dates, what the children said verbatim, in what context. That goes directly to the parental environment argument. That evening, I found something I hadn't gone looking for. I was in the study reviewing files when Vivian asked me to grab her laptop charger from the bedroom. Hers had stopped working. I found the charger, and on the nightstand beside her side of the bed, partially slid under a novel, was a folded piece of paper. I should have left it alone. I didn't. It was a handwritten note, her handwriting, but never sent, never finished. It began, I know this is going to hurt him. I've known for a while, but I can't keep pretending I want a life I stopped wanting 2 years ago. 2 years. At minimum. I refolded exactly as I found it, placed it back under the novel, and walked out of the bedroom. Downstairs, I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window. The city lights were on. The kids were asleep. Everything looked exactly like it always had. I thought about that note for a long time. Not because it wounded me, though it did, but because of what it confirmed. She hadn't stumbled into this. She hadn't been swept away by something she couldn't control. She had made a choice, deliberately, and then looked me in the eye every morning for 2 years while I made her coffee. That note went into the documentation folder. Not as a weapon. As a fact. I was in the middle of a post-op consultation on Tuesday when my phone buzzed 3 times in a row. I ignored it. Then my assistant knocked on the door and said it was Rick, that he'd called the front desk directly, which he had never done in 20 years. I stepped into the hallway. It's online, Rick said without preamble. The gala. Someone posted it. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. How much of it? Enough. 40 seconds. Her voice is clear. Your face when you walk up. That's clear too. He paused. It's moving fast, Nate. 20,000 views in the last 2 hours. I went back into the consultation, finished it professionally, and then sat in my office with the door closed and watched the clip on my phone. 38 seconds. Vivian mid-laugh. The words landing sharp and clean, and then my face, composed, still, turning away without a word. Someone had filmed it from near the bar, and the audio was surprisingly crisp. The comments were already dividing into 2 camps. One side calling Vivian cruel, some calling it staged, others defending her right to honesty in marriage. The side that mattered, the larger one, was asking who the man walking away was, and calling what he did in that moment the most dignified response they'd ever seen. I texted Stuart. The gala video is circulating. 40,000 views and climbing. He replied in minutes. Don't engage publicly. Don't comment. Don't share. Don't acknowledge it to her. Let it run. By the time I got home that evening, Vivian was pacing the kitchen. She had her phone pressed to her ear, and her voice was low and clipped, a damage control tone I recognized from her studio crisis calls. She looked up when I walked in, ended the call, and set the phone face down on the counter. You need to see something, she said. I've seen it. I replied, setting my bag down. Her expression shifted. Then you know this is going to be a problem. People are taking it completely out of context. Vivian. I turned to face her. What context were you imagining? She opened her mouth, then closed it. It was the first time since the gala that she didn't have a quick answer ready. I'm going to put out a statement, she said finally. Clarify that it was a private joke between friends, that things got misconstrued. That's your choice to make, I told her. I'm going to make dinner. She stared at me. You're not going to help me handle this. I looked back at her calmly. You handled the gala on your own. I think you can manage this the same way. I turned back to the stove. She stood behind me for a long moment, and then she left the kitchen. I heard her on the phone again in the hallway. Lower this time, faster, the voice she used when she was genuinely rattled. Good. The next morning, I called Stuart and told him about Cooper's comment regarding Dorian's presence at the studio. Stuart added it to the parenting environment documentation and told me to start keeping a written log, dates, times, children's exact words. I already had 3 entries. That afternoon, Rick came by the house while Vivian was at her uptown location. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a coffee he didn't touch, and for a while neither of us said anything. I should have pushed harder, he said finally. 2 years ago, when I saw them at the Marriott. You told me. I didn't listen. Still, he shook his head. A man watching his friend walk into a wall. I looked at him. Rick, you're here now. That counts more than you know. He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and set a folded paper on the table. My forensic accountant friend looked at the LLC filings as a favor. She found something Marsh missed. He tapped the paper. The DV Creative Partners LLC lists a registered agent, a law firm in Charlotte. That same firm filed paperwork last month for a property transfer. A condo in Asheville, 2 bedrooms, purchased 8 months ago. The buyer on record is a trust, but the trust was established by Vivian, and Sloan is listed as a co-beneficiary. I unfolded the paper. Read it twice. She had bought property with him, not funded his LLC, not paid for hotel rooms, bought real estate together. How much? I asked. Purchase price was $340,000. The down payment, $80,000, matches a wire transfer out of your joint brokerage account from 9 months ago. Rick's voice was level. You signed a quarterly authorization form that covered that transfer period. You wouldn't have caught it without looking specifically. I set the paper down. The folder was getting thicker, and Vivian had no idea how thick it had gotten. Stuart Pratt made the first formal move on a Thursday morning, and he did it with the kind of quiet efficiency that reminded me why Rick had recommended him. He filed a petition for legal separation and initiated discovery proceedings, subpoenas for Vivian's personal bank records, the LLC financials, the Asheville property trust documents, and her phone records going back 26 months. All of it served while Vivian was at her South End studio for a 10 o'clock class. She found out when her attorney, a woman named Diana Goss, she'd apparently had on retainer for months, which told me everything I needed to know about how long she'd been planning, called her at 11:45. Vivian was home by 1. I was in the study reviewing patient notes when she came through the door. I heard her drop her keys on the entryway table, heard the specific quality of her footsteps, fast, deliberate, the stride of someone who has decided they're done being careful. She pushed the study door open. "You filed." I set down my pen. "I did," without saying a word to me. Her voice was sharp, but underneath it was something I hadn't heard before, a current of genuine alarm. "You've been planning your exit for over 2 years," I said. "I'm not sure what conversation you expected." She stepped into the room. "This is going to be ugly, Nathan. You know that." "I know what the discovery documents are going to find," I replied. "I suspect you know too." Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. She had underestimated me, and she was only now beginning to understand the full scope of that miscalculation. "I want to be reasonable about the kids," she said, shifting tactics. "So do I. That's why I've been documenting Dorian Sloane's presence in their environment for the past 3 weeks. Cooper told me Sloane gives instructions to your studio staff when the kids are there. That's in the filing." Her jaw tightened. "You've been building a case against me." "I've been building a case for my children," I said. "There's a difference." She stared at me for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something quieter, and for just a moment, underneath the calculation, I saw something that looked like grief. "I didn't want it to go this way. You made a series of choices over 2 years," I answered. "This is where those choices lead." She left the room without another word. An hour later, I heard her on the phone with Diana Goss again, the voice tight and deliberate, the voice of a woman who had just realized the board was not arranged the way she thought. "I picked the kids up from school that afternoon at the usual time. We stopped for ice cream. Cooper talked about his soccer tournament. Paige told me about a book she'd started for class. Normal. Ordinary. Exactly the kind of ordinary I was fighting to protect. That evening, Stuart called. She's going to counterclaim. Her attorney will likely argue emotional withholding and claim the separation filing was retaliatory. Can they make that stick? "Not against what we have," Stuart said. "But brace yourself. It's going to get public." I had already braced. I've been bracing since the night at the Whitmore, standing at the coat check with Rick, watching my own reflection in the hotel glass. "Let it get public," I told him. "The truth doesn't need any help." The counterclaim came on a Wednesday. Diana Goss filed it with the efficiency of someone who had been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment. Emotional withholding, professional neglect, the separation petition framed as a pattern of control. Stuart had predicted every word of it. What neither of us predicted was Melanie Holt, Rick's wife, Vivian's closest friend from the early studio days, the woman who had been at every birthday, every opening night, every milestone for 12 years. The woman who had been standing 6 feet away at the gala when Vivian said what she said. Melanie called me on Thursday morning while I was between procedures. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she got straight to the point. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know I should have said it sooner." I stepped into an empty consultation room and closed the door. She had been at a studio fundraiser 3 weeks before the gala. Vivian had been drinking, and in a corner conversation with 2 other women, she had said, clearly, without apparent concern for who might hear, that Nathan was terrible in bed, that she hadn't been attracted to him in years, and that Dorian understood her in ways her husband never had. Melanie had heard every word. She had also noticed that a woman nearby, someone she didn't recognize, someone holding a phone at chest height, had been filming. She wasn't filming the event, Melanie said quietly. She was filming Vivian. I let that land. "Did you know who she was?" "No, but I remember what she was wearing. Blue dress, dark hair, mid-30s. She paused. "Nathan, I'm sorry. I told myself it wasn't my business. But when that video came out and I saw the comments defending her, calling her brave, calling her honest, I couldn't stay quiet. I need you to write down what you heard. I told her. Date, location, what was said, exactly. Send it to Stuart Pratt. Can you do that? Already drafted, she said. I just needed to tell you first. I thanked her and stood in that consultation room for a full minute after the call ended. Melanie's statement gave us a documented pattern. Not one impulsive comment at a gala, but a repeated, deliberate campaign to shape the narrative about me among people we both knew. Stuart was going to find that very useful. What Melanie's statement also gave me was something harder to quantify. Vivian had been performing this version of our marriage, the version where I was inadequate, emotionally absent, a man she had outgrown, to an audience for months, possibly longer. She had built the exit story before she built the exit. What Melanie didn't tell me on the phone, but Rick filled in later that evening, was that the call to me had come after something that happened in person. Melanie had run into Vivian at a studio supply store 2 days earlier. They had exchanged the careful pleasantries of women who used to be close and no longer were. And then Vivian had made a comment, offhand, almost reflexive, about how Nathan had never really understood her world, never matched her energy, never been the partner she needed in any real sense. Melanie had set down the item she was holding and looked at her directly. That's not true, Viv, she said. And you know it isn't. Nathan is one of the most decent men I've ever met. Whatever you're telling yourself to justify what you've been doing, don't expect me to agree with it. Vivian had gone very still. Then her expression had shifted into something Melanie described as controlled alarm. The face of a woman recalculating how much someone else knew. He's actually remarkable, Melanie added. In every way you've been telling people he isn't. Vivian had walked out of the store without another word. She had called Diana Goss within the hour.
She spent months telling everyone her husband was less than he was, and then her closest friend looked her in the eye and said, "That's simply not true. No audience, no cameras, just the truth, finally spoken out loud. Some things have a way of catching up."
Rick told me this with a kind of quiet satisfaction he was trying not to show. I sat with it for a moment. The image of Vivian standing in a supply store aisle while 12 years of manufactured narrative collapsed in front of a witness who refused to play along. That evening, I came home to find Paige in the kitchen doing homework and Vivian on the phone in the bedroom. Normal surface. Nothing underneath it. After dinner, I asked Paige how she was holding up. She looked up from her textbook. "Mom told me you were making things difficult on purpose," she said. Not accusatory. She was reporting, the way she always did, precisely. "What do you think?" I asked. She considered it. "I think you're the same as you've always been." She's the one acting different. 11 years old. She saw more clearly than most adults in this situation. "Whatever you hear," I told her, "you come to me." "Okay." She nodded, then went back to her homework. The next morning, I called Stuart with Melanie's information. His response was immediate and focused. A pattern of public disparagement, documented, witnessed, and predating the gala, directly undermines her counterclaim of emotional withholding. She's been telling the story of a broken marriage while simultaneously positioning herself as the reasonable party. He paused. It also puts the gala video in a completely different frame. This isn't one bad night. This is a sustained campaign. He filed the supplemental documentation by noon. By 3 o'clock, Dorian Sloan's attorney sent a letter requesting that any reference to his client's Illinois civil complaint be excluded from proceedings as prejudicial. Stuart responded with 4 pages explaining precisely why it was admissible. Sloan's attorney didn't reply. The PR firm was called Elevation Narrative. I found out about them from Stuart, who had a contact at a competing agency who mentioned that Vivian Carver had engaged them the previous week for reputation restoration following a viral incident. Their rate card started at $15,000 a month. What Elevation Narrative did not know was that one of their junior account managers had a personal policy about clients who lied to them about the facts of their situation. Her name was Brianna. I never met her. I only know what Stuart told me, that she had been given a briefing by Vivian that described the gala video as a misrepresented private joke taken out of context by a bitter spouse, and that when Brianna began her standard background research and found Melanie Holt's written statement, Dorian Sloan's fraud complaint, and the public court filings, She sent an internal memo to her supervisor flagging that the client had materially misrepresented the situation. The supervisor told Vivian directly that they could not proceed with a campaign built on a factual foundation they couldn't verify. Vivian, apparently, did not take that well. 2 days later, Brianna sent an anonymous tip to a Denver lifestyle journalist who covered the wellness and influencer space. The tip included the internal memo, a summary of what the public filings contained, and a note. The story she's selling isn't the one in the documents. The article ran the following Tuesday. It was careful. No accusations. No editorializing. Just a factual account of the court filings, the LLC, the Asheville property, and the pattern of Vivian's public statements about her marriage set against the documented timeline. The headline read, "When the brand becomes the alibi." I read it at my desk at the hospital. Then I forwarded it to Stuart with a single line. "I didn't touch this." He replied, "I know. It's better that way." The article's comment section was exactly the kind of battlefield Stuart had warned me about, but the weight of it ran against Vivian. Her followers had been primed for a sympathetic narrative and instead found a timeline that didn't match the story they'd been told. Sponsors began going quiet. One brand partnership page was scrubbed from her website within 48 hours. Sloan began pulling back visibly. His posts shifted from confident to vague to absent. By the end of the week, he had stopped appearing in Vivian's stories entirely. Cooper noticed. "How come Dorian doesn't come to the studio anymore?" he asked on the drive home from school. "Some people leave when things get complicated," I told him. He thought about that. "That's kind of a coward thing to do." "It is," I agreed. That evening, Vivian was home when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen island with no phone in hand, which was unusual enough that I paused. She looked tired in a way that went past one bad night. The architecture of her composure had been carrying significant weight for months, and some of it was starting to show through. She looked up when I walked in. The elevation thing fell apart. I heard, "Did you do it?" I set my bag down and looked at her directly. "No, I've been building a legal case, Vivian. I haven't needed to do anything else." She studied me for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a dropping of the performance. The audience was gone. It was just the two of us in a kitchen we'd shared for 9 years. "The kids need stability through this," she said quietly. "Then give it to them," I replied. "Show up for their events. Don't put them in the middle of adult conversations. Stop letting Sloan occupy spaces where they are." I kept my voice level. "I'm not asking for the impossible." She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the study with the documentation folder and went through it one more time. Not looking for anything new, just taking stock of what we'd built. 3 months of financial records, 2 witness statements, a PI report, a forensic accounting summary, a property trail, a pattern of public disparagement documented across multiple events. Stuart had said it clearly in our last call. "You're not fighting for your reputation anymore. You're presenting a factual record. Let the facts do the arguing." That was exactly what I intended to do. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. Stuart had spent 2 weeks preparing me for every angle Diana Goss might attempt. He was thorough, methodical, and quietly confident in the way that experienced attorneys get when they know what their file contains. Vivian arrived with Diana, and a composed expression she had clearly practiced. She wore understated clothes, no branding, no statement jewelry, the deliberate aesthetic of a woman trying to look like someone other than her public persona. I noticed, and I said nothing. Judge Patricia Waverly presided. She was in her mid-60s, direct, and had the courtroom economy of someone who had heard every version of marital collapse and was interested only in what the evidence said. Stuart presented our case without theater. Financial documentation first, the LLC, the Asheville property, the $160,000 in transferred funds, the forensic accounting summary. Then the parenting record, Cooper's comments about Sloan's presence at the studio, Page's observed behavioral changes, the school counselor's written note about Cooper's withdrawal. Then Melanie Holt's statement, setting out the pattern of public disparagement across multiple documented occasions. Diana Goss objected 3 times. Judge Waverly sustained none of them. When it was Goss's turn, she presented the counterclaim, emotional withholding, professional preoccupation, the separation petition as control. It was a competent argument. It simply had no documentation behind it. Everything she offered was characterization. Everything Stewart had offered was evidence. Then the court-appointed child psychologist presented her evaluation. She had met with Paige and Cooper separately, reviewed their school records, and observed one session with each child in the family home. Her summary was careful and professional. Cooper's drawings from the evaluation sessions showed his primary home environment as warm and stable. He had drawn his mother's studio as a large building with small figures inside, himself and Paige on the outside. Looking in, he had not been prompted. He had simply drawn what he knew. Paige had been asked to describe a normal week at home. She had described breakfast with her father, help with homework, school pickup, weekend routines. When asked about her mother's schedule, she had said, precisely, without bitterness, she's usually working or with Dorian. The psychologist's recommendation was primary residential custody with the father, with structured supervised visitation for the mother, pending a 90-day review. I watched Vivian's face when that was read into the record. The composed expression held for approximately 4 seconds. Then something underneath it gave way. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just a quiet collapse of the architecture she had been maintaining for months. Diana Goss put a hand on her arm. Judge Waverly ruled in my favor. Walking out of the courthouse, Stewart put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Clean win, he said. You billed it right. I nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a long procedure goes exactly as planned. The release of sustained precision, the body finally allowed to stand down. Rick was waiting in the parking lot. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a coffee from the place near my office that he knew I liked, and we stood there for a minute in the cold December air without needing to fill it with words. That afternoon I picked Paige and Cooper up from school. Cooper ran the last 30 feet to the car. Paige climbed in and immediately started telling me about a book report she'd been stressing over. Normal. Ordinary. I drove them home, and for the first time in 3 months, the house felt like it belonged to all 3 of us completely. 3 months passed the way good months do. Not dramatically, but steadily, like a river finding its proper course after something upstream has been cleared away. Vivian's supervised visitation began in January. The first session was awkward. She brought gift bags, which the kids accepted politely and set aside. The second session was slightly less awkward. By the third, she had stopped bringing things and started simply being present, which was the better version of her and the one I had occasionally glimpsed in the early years of our marriage. I did not interfere with those visits. I did not coach the kids before or debrief them after. That was not my role. My role was to make sure they felt safe at home, and they did. Dorian Sloan's situation deteriorated on its own schedule. The Illinois fraud case added a 4th plaintiff in February. His Charlotte business registrations were suspended. The Asheville condo, purchased in the trust Vivian had funded, was flagged in the civil proceedings, and the court ordered its value assessed for asset recovery. Stewart estimated we'd recover somewhere between 60 and 80 cents on the dollar of what had been transferred. Not everything. Enough. The studio chain was another matter. Stewart negotiated a buyout of my marital interest. Vivian kept the business. I took a structured settlement paid over 3 years. It was fair. It was clean. It was over. Rick and Melanie had the kids one Saturday in March while I handled some paperwork. When I picked them up that evening, Cooper announced that Rick had taught him how to throw a spiral, and Paige had apparently beaten Melanie at 3 consecutive games of chess. I sat at Rick's kitchen table and drank coffee while the kids ransacked his refrigerator. And for a while it felt like something that had been held very tightly in my chest for a long time finally let go. One evening in April, Paige came to the study while I was reviewing patient charts. She sat down across from me the way she did when she had something deliberate to say. I don't hate Mom, she told me. I just don't trust her the same way anymore. That's allowed, I said. Trust takes time to rebuild. Do you think she'll try? I thought about it honestly. I think she's starting to understand what she lost. Whether she does the work, that's up to her. Paige nodded. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. I'm glad you didn't just let it happen. Some dads would have. I looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't going to disappear, I told her. That was never going to be the outcome. She went back to her room. I sat there for a while after she left, thinking about what she'd said. I'm glad you didn't just let it happen. Neither was I. In May, I received a card in the mail. No return address, Vivian's handwriting. Inside was one paragraph. I spent 2 years building a story about you because it was easier than admitting what I was doing. You were never the problem. You were the only person in that marriage who was actually trying. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that. I read it twice. Sat on the desk. Did not feel the need to respond. The apology was real. I believe that. But an apology doesn't reassemble what was broken. It just closes the file on it. I had already moved forward. The closing of a file is not the same as opening a new one. Cooper made the travel soccer team that spring. Paige won a school writing competition with an essay about what home means. She read it to me the night before she submitted it, sitting at the kitchen table under the overhead light with the draft in both hands, voice steady, choosing each word like it mattered. It did matter. Everything in that house mattered. That was the thing Vivian had never been able to see, or had seen and chosen to walk away from anyway. I wasn't going to waste time being angry about that anymore. I was too busy being here.
Nathan never raised his voice. He never chased anyone or begged for anything. He just kept showing up for his kids, for the facts, and for himself. The people who tried to diminish you are counting on you to believe them. He didn't, and that changed everything. Thank you for listening today. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. I read every single one. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.